All right. So yeah, we started React this week, and I'd say that there's basically three like core things you need to think about. One is components. So what is a component? And then state and props. So what is a component?
It's a function that returns JSX or like a single element of HTML.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a function that returns, let's just say for short, HTML. But yeah, JSX. So it's a function, you call it, and it returns HTML. So you could write a function like that, uh, and it would just return HTML, maybe as a string or something. So if you were to do this at a very like primitive, low level, like write your own thing, you could write a function that returns a string or an HTML, or that that creates those elements on the DOM, or however you want to do it. So that's a component, and it's important to kind of be aware of that because it has implications for props and state later. So how do you call a function? I mean, how do you call a component? If a component is a function that returns JSX, how do you call it?
With like angle brackets and then like a capital letter of the function name and then like closing the tag, but you put it in like another component that's getting rendered, probably like your app.
Yeah. So I mean that for example, right here. So here's we'll look at this example in a sec, but here's and the app top level, whatever, and then we're importing another component, which is just a function, and we're saying basically call this right here. But how so that's kind of how we tell React how we want things structured, but how does this actually get called? Like what does that mean to call this function?
Doesn't it mean to just render the HTML that
Yeah.
returns?
So you'll hear this term render a lot when you talk about React. And what that basically means is call the function. Render means call this function. So what happens when you change the state? If we have a component, for example, just look at this for a sec. If we have a component that has state, what happens when you change the state?
It will re-render that component every time that state changes.
Exactly. So re-render just means call the function again. So when you have state in this component, when this state changes, it calls this function, which is going to return this stuff again. So changing state means trigger a re-render, which means call this function again. Why do they do that? And why call this, like, why recreate all of this JSX every time state changes?
Is it so you don't have to like refresh the page every time?
Yeah, at a higher level, that's part of what React does. It like efficiently manages changes in the DOM.
Dynamically updating things.
Yeah. What about in terms of pure versus impure?
I I know that as soon as we give a component state, it's not pure anymore because it depends on something.
Well, yeah, so that's a very good thought here. So we we call this function, which returns some JSX, which React takes care of rendering ultimately. But then we can change something that will cause this function to be called again. So it seems like it's maybe impure. It's like the function is dependent on something externally. But the reason React is structured the way it is, why this has to get called again, is because React wants components to be pure. So if I change something here, I call the function again, and I basically get a brand new thing. So the difference between, let's say, a pure function and an impure function when it comes to arrays. So if I have, let's do this real quick. That to do JavaScript. Let So if I want to, let's say, have an array with like 2, 4, 6, I have a couple ways of doing this. I can mutate this, right? I can mutate the original thing, and that is impure. That's impure. So I can do like for each. So my r dot for each, something like num equals num times 2, something like that, and then let's see. I don't think I can.
I think for each doesn't
I
return
know.
anything.
Yeah, it doesn't return anything. I'm doing this stupidly. So what I need to do is actually grab a reference to the index, I think. So I think for each will take 2 parameters. Yeah, number index. And then I will do my r at index equals. I think that will work fine. This is not. Okay, so what I've done here is I have one array. I create it initially, and then when I want it to change, I mutate it directly. So this is a side effect. So for each does side effects, meaning it's not pure, meaning I'm changing things outside in the in the outer world. There's a pure version of this, which we've seen. So what's the pure version of this?
Would you just copy the array and then mutate the copied array?
Yeah, I mean, essentially that's one way of doing it.
Would you just set the array to the new value?
You can't directly do that because it would essentially be a mutation, because you would just have a reference. You would have to you would either have a different reference, or you would have you have to change this. The way you do this is with map, for example, instead of for each. So num, and then num times 2. And if I print console.log to r, to get the same. Right. So so I was expecting 246, 246, but I didn't get that. Why didn't I get 246, 246?
The for each modified the original array before it got handled.
Exactly. So this is a perfect example of why you want to avoid side effects. Because I looked at this and I say, okay, this is this. But then somewhere else in the code, in this case, it was just the line above it, but it could have been anywhere else in the code base. This actually gets modified, and then I try to use it, and surprise, surprise, it's different. So I'll just comment this out for now.
And what's it called again, chat? Is it like something by reference and the
Pass by reference and pass by value.
okay, yeah.
So for things like arrays and objects, it's passed by reference. But here, this array is totally different than this one. So I now have created two arrays. So rather than mutating this array, I have created a new one. And if I want to have another array that multiplies by 3, I create a new one. So anytime I want something to change, I create a new one rather than modifying what already exists.
But you could, but by doing it this way, if you do modify the original array, then the other arrays will be modified as well, which might be something you want to do, I would think. But you
Yeah.
still-
So if I'm programming in a pure manner, then I would never change this anywhere in my code. I would never have a side effect that would if all of my code is pure and all of my functions, they only act on their inputs and return an output and don't do anything else, then you don't have to worry about it. But if you do stuff like this, you have stuff like this floating around in your code, then you do have to worry about it. So that's one of the benefits of using, let's say maximizing your use of pure functions. It's just like stuff like this is just a bug, a hard to figure out bug waiting to happen. So React does this. This is what React does. Instead of, oh, you want to like change your component, you have your JSX and you want to make a modification. Oh, well, let me just go in there and like modify that for you. No, it doesn't do that. It says, I am going to create a brand new. I'm going to call this function again and return a brand new thing for you. So that's what is happening here. So we have use state. When the state changes, React will re-render, i.e. call this function again, which will return a brand new thing, JSX, with the updated values. So we're not mutating this, we are creating new ones. So that's why React does it that way. Okay, any questions about that?
Does all the like, I know that React has a virtual DOM. Does that come from the JSX? Like in JSX, all the function calls happen, and then when everything's ready, it goes over to index HTML. I'm trying to figure out like how it updates just what needs to be updated, I guess.
Yeah. So ultimately, I mean, it can show you this in a sec, but ultimately, everything that you make here is just going to get compiled down to JavaScript, blah, 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 blah. So, but yeah, I mean, the whole, one of the benefits of React is that it kind of tries to make DOM changes efficient. So it does it by having an in-memory DOM, and then also like sometimes batching things. So if you have a bunch of changes like that happen in rapid succession, it can kind of hold on and then group them together and just do one big change. Okay, all right. So let's look at the actual example. So there are a few, actually, first we're going to create a React project here. So there are a few like common patterns that you'll see once you start using React. And what we're going to talk about today, lifting state is one of them. So you'll almost certainly end up doing this. Like as you develop, this is just like a natural process. All right, so first off, I'm going to create an app using Vite and to do, and I'll choose React and JavaScript, and then install and install. All right, so let's go here. Cool. You guys have React DevTools installed?
I do, but every time I've tried to look at like components, it like times out. I don't know if it's like how I
Yeah,
have it like installed or if it just takes a while.
yeah, it's kind of annoying. So this worked. I usually just refresh a couple times and it seems to work eventually. But so this I would strongly recommend that you install the React DevTools extension. So this allows you to kind of see the actual structure of your components, and then, for example, state. So I can, to actually see this component. If you have lots of other components, you can kind of focus on them rather than because your component structure can be different than like the HTML that you're ultimately getting. So it just makes your life much easier. And you can see the state. So there's a built-in little thing here. If I change the count, the state updates right here. So oftentimes as you're developing, you might want to see what is my actual state, even if it's not getting rendered properly. So I pretty much always have this window open when I'm developing stuff. All right, so we have the basic app. And when you use Vite, there's a couple other like starter tools. Vite is kind of a minimal one, but you get app.jsx, and it starts with this dummy example, which has state. And how does that state change?
On a button click.
Yeah, so in this case, it's inline, but we have an event that we're listening for, is a click, and then we have an event handler. So we could actually move that out. So I'm going to call handle click. It's usually better to not inline stuff. And I'm going to call this we can do something like that, and it should work identically. If I refresh this. So the way this works is when, this is initially rendered, basically React does its thing. It decides, okay, I'm going to render this initially. It paints it, it will call this function. This function returns JSX. What are these like blank tags?
Fragments, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So what happens if I get rid of these fragments?
Get a bunch of squigglies.
Yeah, yes.
You're actually gonna cry at you.
Why is it gonna be so upset?
It wants
Because
one thing, like a one element.
Yeah, it wants you to return one thing. And if I remove this, then I have a bunch of sister components here. The older way of doing this is to use like dummy divs, which should also work. Let's see. Yeah, that's why I did this. So you can leave it. So this should work identically. It's just if I look at the elements. So I have this this empty div right here. So that's fine. I would use the fragment. But yeah. So we have this component. We have a way to change the state. When it initially renders, it's gonna call this function. The default state will be 0. So it's gonna call this function, and whatever this state is, in this case count, is gonna be 0. So it's gonna call this function, and it's gonna have everything like hard-coded basically. So count is 0. So that's what it's gonna do. And then when you change the state, it's gonna call this, and it knows, the React, the React stuff is keeping track of this. It knows, oh, this state has changed. I need to call this app function again. So it's gonna calculate the new state, which in this case will be 1, and then it will recall this function and return all of this stuff, except all these values are now going to be like hard-coded in there. So the updated value will be there. So we're going to get a brand new set of this stuff with the current value. All right. So I'm just going to get rid of this, and we'll look at the example. We're gonna have to import, I think. Actually, yeah. So the first step kind of has everything all in one. Great. So here's the to-do, item 1, item 2, item 3. And if I'm gonna look using the React Dev Tools, I can see the components. I just have one component, and I have state right here. So I can add something, and it should show up right there. So if for whatever reason, like this wasn't hooked up, I could still see that the state had changed right there. Okay. So what's happening here? Well, we have this app, we have some state, and we're returning some JSX. So we're returning a list of stuff which we're creating based on the to-dos, which comes from our state. And then we have an event handler. We're listening for the submit event on this form. And then we're going to call handle submit, which is going to change the state. So the set functions can either take just like a primitive value, or they can take a function. So if you're doing something like, so this is basically the preferred way of doing it. If your state is kind of like modifying what already exists. So like that counter, for example, should probably take a function rather than just returning the value. But in either case, that's what it's doing. We're changing the state. We're taking all of the previous state, which is basically all of these elements in this array, and then we're just adding this on. So this syntax might look unfamiliar, but all we're doing is we're taking all of this stuff, and then we're adding this onto it. It's basically appending. We're appending, except that we're returning a new array. We're not mutating this by appending. We're creating a new array. All right, so this works fine, but if we're thinking about, okay, how could we break this up? How can we make this more modular? How can we make this easier to modify later? Have less interdependencies, all of that usual stuff. I think at the very least, we could start separating things out. Like here's this submit thing, and then here's this list element. We could definitely go finer grained. You know, we could have like a button component. We could have a, you know, this like text box component. We could have individual item component. We could have so there's definitely like we could go deeper, but we'll just start with breaking this up into two components. So to do that, I'm gonna create a components folder. You don't have to do this, but you should have some kind of organization. And I guess I'll just follow the README here. So a submit to do. And then display to do. And then the new app.js. Okay, so what we've done here is basically, instead of having one giant thing that does everything, we're now breaking it up into smaller pieces that we can recompose later. So app is now kind of just an empty vessel, and its job is to just contain these other elements. So submit to do. So how does that work? Well, that comes from right here. So we have our state here and the handle submit, and it works very similarly, except it now returns this, and we have this other component separated out, which is display to-dos. And display to-dos, what is this right here?
Props.
Prop.
Yeah, exactly. It's props. And it's, you know, it's destructured. So props is an object, and you can destructure it like this and pull out a specific key. So we could do it like this. This is the fancy way to do it. You could also just do props, and then here we do props dot to dos, etc. So we'll just make sure this still works. Okay, looks like it works. And if I go it'll take a second. And I'm going to add one more just so you can see the state over here. So the state is actually updated over there. So this works identically to the previous one. You can do props or, you know, more modernly, I guess. You can destructure it, pull out just the key that we need from the props object, and then use it directly. Okay, so when does submit to do get re-rendered?
When the to-dos change?
Yeah, exactly. So when this changes, this function gets called again. What about display to-dos?
I think the same thing, since it's in the return. So like when we call the first function, we'll return the other component, but maybe I'm.
Yeah, so it also components will re-render when they get new props. So components will re-render when their state changes, or when they get new props. So if to-dos is changed, then this has new props, which means it will also get re-rendered, which means get called again. And why does it have to get called again? Because these are pure functions. These components are pure functions, and something has changed here. So we want to return something different, right? If to-dos is different, then this is going to be different. So we're going to return something different. And so rather than mutating it and using a side effect, we're just going to create a brand new thing here. So that's why this has to get re-rendered when the props change. Okay, so if we look at this, so again, the dev tools are nice because now we can see the structure. We have app and then submit to do and display to dos. But this structure is, it's fine. Again, it works and it's fine. Now we have separate components, so we're taking a step in the right direction. Things are more modular. But should this component really be dependent on this? It's not obvious that it should be. And if we wanted to add other stuff, then a whole bunch of other stuff has to be kind of under this submit button, which is a little strange. And if we wanted to break this whole thing up into different, like a button and something else, then it just starts getting a little weird. You create dependencies that don't really match the structure of what you're doing. So we're gonna do something basically called lift state. So right now the state is contained in this submit to do. But really what we would like is for the submit to do and display to dos to be sisters, not parent child, but sisters. So we want app here or whatever, and then we want these two to be on the same level. So that's what we want, but what's the problem with that? If I take display to dos and I move it up a level so it's a sister of submit to dos, what's the problem?
Would it have to do with the props?
Yeah, the problem is that submit to do is using state to keep track of what's happening. It's using state to re-render itself. And then there's a dependency. This other component needs that information. So display to dos needs that information that's in the state of submit to do. And the only way to pass information is from parent to child, right? Props only go down. They only go from parent to child. So if I pull this up to the same level, now they're parallel. So I can't pass information from submit to do. I can't go sideways, right? I can't go from submit to do to display to dos if they're on the same level. But this still needs that information. So the solution is to pull that state, to lift the state up to a common parent. So that's what we're gonna do now. So we'll just, I'll copy this and we can talk about it. So app.jsx. And yeah, we can maybe make some further tweaks after this. Submit to do. It's gonna be that. Okay, so now if we look, I'm gonna go into the DevTools real quick. You can see that this is flat. So these are now, sisters. So we have app, and now the state is an app. So the state that both of these components need is an app. So if I change this, everything works the same way. Which is why, notice that the UI hasn't changed at all, but we've had like 3 different iterations of stuff. So that's one reason why the DevTools are important. But okay, so everything works the same way, but now these are in parallel. but how do we do that? So we put the state up here, and we also, because the state is here, we have to change state here, right? You can't, you can't just change state anywhere you want. State is a component internal thing. So we have the state, and then we have the ability to change the state. But this submit to do still needs to kind of basically change the state of the parent. So it's a little weird. And the way we get around this is we pass this function that changes state down to submit to do. Now if we look at submit to do, it will take as a prop this handle submit function. And this works because functions are just objects. So this is now basically a higher order function, right? It's a function that takes another function as a parameter. So app is basically delegating its handle submit to its child. And because it's doing that, submit to do can effectively change the state of its parent. And then it can consume that state right here. And so can its sister display to do's. So you put state up in the parent component, you put the function to change the state up in the parent component, which is the only place that it can be. So that's just the rules. That's the rules of React. And you kind of bend the rules, or you get around this by delegating or passing down the change, the set state function to a child, and then the child can change the state of the parent, and then all of that information, all of that state can just flow down from there.
So the fact that you're passing down the function allows you to change the state of the parent, basically.
Yes, yeah. So what is like at a literal level, the parent still owns the state and the state changer right here. The parent owns this stuff. But because essentially this is the important part right here. This set to do's is a function. We can pass this down as a component, or as basically a parameter. We can pass that down as a parameter, and then that function can be called somewhere else. So even though, excuse me, in some sense, submit to do is now the thing that changes the state, it's doing it indirectly. It's calling a function which is owned by its parent. So the state is here. This has props. The to-dos has props, and this also just has props. So we've basically made submit to do and display to do stupid. Right? All they have to do, they just receive props and just and show them. That's really all they do. All of the the brains have been moved up a level. So this makes it easier to add another feature. So if we wanted to add another feature now, I have this here. Let's see. Yes. So let's add another feature that also relies on that state, which is a count. So you have the to-dos, and you also get a total to-dos. So I go here. And then in app.js, I will import this. I get some auto filler, which is nice. And let's see if this works. Okay, we've done something wrong here. Counts.
You have to pass any props to do count? Yeah, I don't think you're passing the props in.
Thank you. It should still should render even if it doesn't have those props. But yes, let's do that as well. Okay. Yeah, I think maybe because I was checking the length of something that didn't exist. Okay. So now we have this, and all three of these now use the state, but they're also independent components. So I don't have to put, to do count and display to dos underneath the submit to do thing. And really, like, this is fine. Where ideally you want app to be like just renders components. So I'll just go ahead and do it. So I'll pull this out into like a parent component. This will be the import. I'm not sure if I'll need that, but export default function. And then I'll just restructure this real quick. So I'm going to import all these other things. I'll get rid of that. Not come from components. This. This. And then I can make app stupid. And it's only going to kind of be state here. So now app is really, yeah, app doesn't have to worry about anything other than like you just pass it the list of stuff it needs to render. The complexity has kind of been delegated down one level, so it's doing the same thing, but now anything that has to do with like a to-do can be under here, and this can kind of manage the state for all of the to-do stuff. All right, let's make sure this works. Okay, so that's pretty much it. So this is, thinking about React, it's important to think about, okay, what components do I need? What state do they need, if any, and what props do they need, if any? And in order to determine if a component needs state, you ask the question, does anything need to change? Is anything changeable about this component? If the answer is yes, then it needs state. If it needs information from somewhere else, then it needs props.
So like even on all the components, like even though you're not using the use state, you still have to have that import use state at the top as well.
No, you don't.
Oh, okay.
So I can,
Just in the to do container, that one's required. Okay.
yeah, this one is not using state, so get rid of that.
What about the prop squigglies? Is there a way to get rid of this?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if this is a new thing, or so we just started using Vite instead of, there's another great React app tool. So we switched to this, and it's very picky here. I'm not really sure. I haven't looked into why it's complaining, but I should. I'll do that after the lecture because it's pretty annoying.
I wonder if you destructure it outside of the parameter, if it would not squiggle.
I think it still was doing that. It's like, yeah, it wants me to check something. Let's see. Yeah, props validation. I don't even know what that is, to be honest. But I'll check it out. Has anyone looked into that?
I don't think I actually have that issue on my machine.
Yeah, mine doesn't have the squigglies either.
Yeah, it must be a VS Code setting that I have. Some very proactive linter. So listen. Props validation. Name is missing in props validation. Yeah, it looks like it. Anyway, I'm not doing all that. So let's disable that. All right, cool. Yeah, let me stop recording real quick and then I'll